On September 13th, 1848, a 25-year-old railroad foreman named Phineas Gage packed explosive powder into a hole in solid rock. A spark ignited it early. A 3-foot iron rod, over an inch thick and weighing 13 pounds, shot straight through his skull, entering under his left cheekbone and exiting through the top of his head. It landed nearly 80 feet away, covered in blood and brain tissue. His crew ran over expecting to find a corpse. Instead, they found Phineas sitting up, talking. Within a few minutes, he was helped into an ox cart and rode nearly 3/4 of a mile into town to see a doctor, reportedly cracking jokes along the way about how he wouldn't be needing a doctor's help for long. He was conscious for the entire ride. He described what happened to the physician who treated him with total clarity, in full detail, no confusion, no memory gaps. By any reasonable medical expectation of 1848, Phineas Gage should have been dead within the hour. He wasn't. He survived the initial trauma. He survived the massive infection that followed weeks later, one that swelled his brain, sent him into delirium, and nearly killed him a second time, leaving him in a semi-comatose state for days, while his doctor genuinely believed he was watching a man die slowly instead of quickly. And against essentially every odd available to 19th century medicine, in an era before antiseptics, before anesthesia as we know it, before any real understanding of infection, he recovered. Physically, within a few months, Phineas could walk, talk, and function. His memory was intact. His speech was intact. His motor skills returned almost completely. To the doctors examining him, it looked medically like a near-total recovery from an injury that should have been instantly fatal twice over. But the people who actually knew him told a different story. His friends and coworkers began describing him using a phrase that would echo through psychology textbooks for the next 150 years. He was no longer Gage. Before the accident, colleagues described him as reliable, even-tempered, and well-liked, a capable foreman with a solid business sense, considered by his employers to be the most efficient and capable man in their employ. After the accident, according to the detailed accounts of Dr. John Harlow, the physician who treated him and continued to follow his case for years afterward, Gage became impatient, irreverent, prone to profanity he hadn't used before, and unable to stick to plans. He'd devise elaborate schemes for his future and abandon them almost immediately for another scheme, equally elaborate, equally abandoned. He struggled to hold down steady work, drifting between jobs that never quite fit. The consistent language used by people who'd known him for years wasn't that he'd been injured, it was that he'd been replaced. Same face, same voice, same memories. Different person operating the controls. This is where the story becomes genuinely important to the history of science, because at the time, the dominant belief about the brain was that it functioned as a single, unified organ. Thought, personality, morality, reasoning, none of it was believed to be localized to specific regions the way, say, the heart pumps blood or the lungs process air. The idea that damaging one particular area of the brain could selectively alter someone's personality while leaving memory, speech, and physical ability completely intact was not just novel. It contradicted the prevailing medical consensus of the era almost entirely. Gage's case became one of the earliest and most cited pieces of evidence for something called functional localization, the idea that different regions of the brain are responsible for different specific functions, rather than all functions being distributed evenly throughout. The rod had passed primarily through his frontal lobe, and specifically damaged areas we now associate heavily with what neuroscientists call executive function: impulse control, planning, social judgment, and emotional regulation. For the first time, doctors had a real-world case suggesting that the frontal lobe wasn't just generically important for thinking in some vague sense. It appeared to be specifically responsible for the parts of a person that make them behave like a socially functional, predictable adult, the parts that plan ahead, restrain urges, and read a room. Here's where the story gets more complicated than most retellings suggest, though, because for over a century, the popular version of Gage's story became exaggerated well beyond what the actual historical record supports. Later, psychology textbooks, passed down through decades of secondhand summary, described him as a violent drifter, a man who descended into total chaos, lost every job he ever held, and died in poverty and disgrace, a cautionary tale about how one accident could destroy a person completely and permanently. That version made for a cleaner story, a tidier moral. It just wasn't entirely true. In the 2000s, researchers going back through the original historical records, including Harlow's actual case notes and newly uncovered employment history from Chile and New England, found a more nuanced picture than the textbook myth. After his initial rough period, which by all accounts genuinely was severe, Gage appears to have found long-term stable work. He spent roughly 7 years driving stagecoaches in Chile, a job that required consistent scheduling, responsibility, memorizing complex routes, and interacting reliably with passengers day after day. Hardly the behavior of someone in total permanent psychological collapse. This suggests something modern neuroscience finds fairly plausible, that Gage's brain, over years, showed at least some degree of adaptive reorganization, or what researchers call neuroplasticity. Other regions gradually compensating for the damaged ones, allowing him to relearn a version of structure and routine, even if the underlying injury never fully healed. Gage eventually developed epilepsy, likely a long-term consequence of the original injury, and died in 1860, 12 years after the accident, at the age of 36, following a series of worsening seizures. His mother, at Dr. Harlow's request, later exhumed his body and donated his skull, along with the actual iron rod that had caused the injury, to Harvard Medical School, where both remain on display today, sitting in the same case, permanently reunited. Modern neuroscience has revisited Gage's case extensively, using CT scans and 3D computer reconstructions of his skull to model exactly which brain regions the rod likely damaged as it passed through. Researchers have used this reconstruction to compare against modern patients with similar localized frontal lobe injuries, and the pattern holds up remarkably well, more than a century and a half later. Damage to those specific regions, particularly areas of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is consistently associated in modern patients with exactly the kind of changes Gage's contemporaries described: difficulty planning, long-term, impaired social judgment, and struggles regulating impulsive behavior, even when memory, language, and basic intelligence remain completely intact. The 1848 description and the 2020's brain scan agree with each other almost perfectly, which means Gage's case wasn't exaggerated science. If anything, the raw medical facts turned out to be more precisely, specifically accurate than the myth built around them. A change happened. It just wasn't the total, permanent destruction of a man that later versions of the story claimed. It was something more specific, and in some ways more unsettling. Proof that the particular version of you that plans ahead, restrains impulses, and behaves predictably around other people can live in a specific damageable piece of tissue, no larger than a fist, sitting just behind your forehead. That tissue, and the rod that passed through it, are still sitting in a case at Harvard, 175 years later. Not because Phineas Gage was a monster, and not because he was destroyed, because for the first time in recorded medical history, a single accident proved that personality itself has an address inside your skull. It can be located, it can be damaged, and under the right, terrible circumstances, it can change. While the rest of you, memory, speech, movement, the person everyone assumes is fundamentally you, stays completely eerily intact.